What's up YouTubers, this is the second part of object-oriented programming, and in this part we will be implementing the idea of multiplayer online gaming through the help of object-oriented programming language, and the one that I've selected is Python, but the same idea goes for any other programming language like Java or C++. So I'll be acting like a complete beginner, in which one can come up with a very simple and not a robust solution. As explained in the beginning of the part 1, where I was giving the theoretical explanation, that the bad implementation of this would be to write individual methods for each of the player. So that can be, for example, I'm writing a function named as player, and let's simply call this player 1 and copy and paste this player 2 and player 3, and write the code for each of the player multiple times. So now we know that the code would be the same, but we are writing the same code again and again. So that's not how we want to do it, because it will gonna take extra amount of memory. So let's get rid of this. So let's suppose we have a single function named as player, and we are calling this function from outside, and first time naming it as p1 and the second time we are naming it as p2. Well, actually what is happening over here is we are not creating the copies of this function. We are actually running this function 2 times with multiple arguments. So if I run this, so first time I will run this function with name Max, and the second time I will run the same function with name John. So that's now how we want to implement this, because during the gameplay the players needs to update their ammo, or when they are hit they need to decrease their health, and similar functions like that, and we need to control all of these variables from outside of these functions. But we cannot do this with this implementation, because for example, if I add a small piece of function inside this function and call it as add ammo, the problem is the scope of this function is only inside the player. We can only call this function ammo, add ammo, from within this function player. We cannot call this function from outside. So that is the problem. We don't want that, because during the gameplay we need to access all of the functions of each player outside of the function. So how we will do that? Well, that's where classes comes in. Now what is a class? As explained to you in my first part, that we will be making multiple copies of that code. Now that what classes provides us, it provides us to create as many copies as we want, and each copy is known as object. Now rather than going into more theoretical stuff, let's directly implement the class. You will get to know what I mean. Now let's create a class and name it as player, and of course we need to write some functions in it. Let's suppose set name and pass the argument as name, and let's create another function, set ammo, print ammo. So that is a very simple class that I've created and named it as player. So if I call this class from outside and give it a name as p1 equals player and p2 equals player. Now what is actually happening here is, rather than running this class 2 times, we are creating the copies of this class 2 times. The one copy name is p1 and the second copy name is p2. Now the problem over here is that we are creating 2 copies of the same piece of code that is literally written only once. Now how this piece of code will individually identify the variables of both of these copies? Well, in classes we use a key term called self that actually represents the individual objects that it has created. For example, we have created an object of this class and named it as p1. So this self will be p1 for this object, and this self will be p2 for this object. Now with the help of this we can individually identify the objects of p1 or p2. Now let's see how. If I try to print this object p1 and print p2, and let's call the function set name from p1 and give it a name as Max, and same goes for the p2 as set name and give it a name as John. So I'm calling 2 functions from different objects. Now let's see how it works for the same class, and let's print here name set for self. Let's give it a name as p1 as p2. Okay, so let's try to run this and see what is the effect. So now we can see that the first time I'm printing this P1 from outside of the class, so it says that P1 is an instance of the class player and its ID is this. Now when I try to run the function set name from P1, it says name max set for an instance of class player with ID this. So this ID it will be exactly the same as this one, and same goes for the P2. Now is that all we need? No, I don't think so, because right now I'm only talking about individual functions that are being defined inside this class, and we are only accessing these functions individually for both of the objects. But what about the variables? So I'm calling this function set name, but I'm not assigning this max to any variable. So for example, if I define another function over here as get ammo, so now this needs to return the ammo left for that individual player. Ammo. Now here you can see that this variable ammo is not defined over here, and that is because this class cannot individually identify that for which object this variable is. Is this ammo for P1 or is this ammo for P2? So for that reason we need to individually identify the variables in the same way we did for the functions. So let's suppose for the functions we always put the first argument as self, and for the variables we always need to name the variables as self dot the variable name. So now this class will individually identify that is this ammo for P1 or P2 by this self. If I'm calling this from P1, then this will be P1.ammo, and if I'm calling this from P2, then it will be P2.ammo. Now let me set this one as well. So one important thing to note over here is that we cannot change the class variables from outside. We can only access the functions from outside of the class. So for example, P1 dot, I can only see the functions, but I cannot see the variables. So we can change the variables inside the class by the help of the functions. So how we'll do that is, let's suppose we set the ammo for player 1 as 1000, and now in this function it's taking an argument ammo as 1000, and it needs to set this 1000 to the P1 variable named as ammo. So we'll say that self.ammo equals ammo. Now it takes this 1000 as an argument and it gives this argument to self.ammo, that is a personal variable for this object P1. And let's create another function over here as shoot. Now in this shoot we know that when a person will be shooting, the ammo decreases. So we'll say self.ammo equals self.ammo minus 1. So we give player 1 1000 ammo, and then the player 1 shoots for, let's say, 4 times, and let's check the ammo left for player 1. Get ammo. Now let's try to run this. Oh, I haven't given any print statements, so okay, so there you go. What you can see here is that player 1 was initially assigned with 1000 ammos, and then player 1 shoots for 4 times, and then we try to print the remaining ammo for the player 1 and we get 996. Great, that is good. And now if we try to do the same thing for player 2, we're giving the same amount of ammos, 1000, as we gave to the player 1, and the player 2 shoots for 2 times, and let's try to get the remaining ammo for the player 2 as well. So as you can see, player 2 remaining ammos is 998, whereas player 1 max has the remaining ammos as 996. So the interesting thing about the object oriented can be noted here is that we have written the variable ammo literally one time in the code, and we are using it multiple times. So that's what object literally means that we are creating the objects multiple times for the same piece of code and using it again and again, and we can differentiate each of the variables and the functions inside the class by the help of each object that is individually identified as self inside the class. Now, before calling off for this tutorial, I will like to cover one last thing. If you see these three lines, so at the first line we are creating an object, and at the second line we are setting the name, and at the third line we are setting the ammo. So how about we do all of these three steps in only one step? For example, when we are declaring an object for this class, we pass in our arguments as name and ammo. So for that we don't need these two lines. I'll just get rid of this. So we have removed set ammo and set name, so then we obviously have to remove these functions as well. So how a class handles these kind of arguments, and that's where constructor comes in. So in Python you have a built-in function called __init__. That is a short form for initialization, and when we create this object, this function will always run first, and we have to pass these arguments into the arguments of init function. So as we know, the first argument will always be self, and the rest of them we can pass as many as we want. So for the first one we'll go for name and ammo, and now we need to assign these arguments to the individual objects variables names. So we'll say self dot name equals name and self dot ammo equals ammo. So initially when you are calling this class player, it automatically runs this function init and assigns the variables to the specific object that you have created. So for the P1 you have created a variable name as max and the variable name ammo as 1000. So that goes for all of these objects whenever you will call from anywhere. And I guess that's all for now. I hope I have made you understand the topic more clear. If you find this video helpful, don't forget to comment, share, like, and subscribe, because in the next parts I will be covering some advanced topics related to these classes and some more fun stuff. Thank you so much.